Hello.
Oh.
All right.
Hi there.
All right. Welcome, everyone. So today we have with us Tim, Lauren, and Dalton, who just gave a presentation on the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam draft and the lessons for the sciences. And so I'm just going to turn over to Tim to start us off and give a brief introduction of the folks that were there at the session.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. I am delighted to be here today, and thanks for all of you who came out. My name's Tim Johnson. I'm from Willamette University. And back in 1969, two scientific milestones took place on national TV, broadcast live to Americans around the country. And one of them we all recognize as a scientific milestone, the Apollo moon landing. But folks might not recognize that the Vietnam Selective Service Lotteries also were a scientific milestone. In addition to affecting the lives of tens of thousands of young people in the U.S. as well as their families, they also created a type of natural experiment that social scientists have studied for decades now. And we've, as a result, learned a lot about the lives of those who are affected by the draft, but then also we've learned more general insights about how our social, political, and economic lives are lived. And so to that extent, they've provided us a great ability as scientists to learn more about the world in which we live. And it was a byproduct of the fact that there was an arbitrary selection of individuals through the draft lotteries for military service in the Vietnam conflict. The first lottery took place in 1969, and then those lotteries continued until 1975. Lottery numbers were drawn, though only in the first 3 years of the draft were numbers called for induction, thus creating this type of natural experiment.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Tim.
Oh,
So
you're
that was really great. So what I found particularly interesting about the session was that when we first started talking about the draft, it actually wasn't arbitrary. And so, do you want to talk a little bit about how it actually wasn't arbitrary and how that affected?
Sure. So the historical nuances here are important, which is the first draft lottery was an attempt to create an arbitrary system of drawing folks into military induction to be pre-screened for then service in Vietnam. It turned out that that first attempt, although within any given month of birth dates that were called, you'd find a quasi-random order. The overall process created a systematic bias towards dates that were later in the calendar year. So what happened was the selective service system in the inaugural 1969 draft lottery took the capsules that contained the dates that would be drawn in order to assign lottery numbers. And so the system worked where little strips of paper had a date on them. They were placed in a capsule. The capsules were placed in an urn, and then they were drawn one at a time to determine the order of induction into the military in the subsequent calendar year. The folks involved in the selective service system would crack open a capsule. They'd read the date. That would have a lottery number assigned to it, beginning with lottery number 1, proceeding till for the first inaugural lottery, number 366, because it was a birth year, and they were assigning these numbers by birth date. Well, the way the selective service system had orchestrated the draw, they had taken the capsules in a box and they'd placed the capsules in the box in chronological order. Thus, when they poured those capsules into the urn from which they'd be drawn, those that fell deeper into the bowl were the ones that were from earlier in the calendar year. Those that were higher in sort of a strata at the top of the bowl were those from later in the calendar year, thus meaning that if they weren't subsequently stirred well, which seemed to be the case, there was maybe a couple of paddle stirs that then preceded the actual draw, then it meant that you would have numbers that were on the top of this urn from which they were being drawn, dates from the top of the urn from which they're being drawn that were later in the calendar year, December dates, November dates, October dates. So this created a degree of bias in this first lottery number towards dates later in the calendar year, and a team of statisticians led by the eminent statistician John W. Tukey, they devised a plan that would help resolve, pardon me there, that would help resolve this problem, whereby they used two forms of randomization. They would order the capsules prior to being put into the drawing receptacle based upon a random number ordering, and then they would turn these two they would turn this capsule, or excuse me, this vessel multiple times and then draw from it, but they would only draw one part of the two pieces of information that were needed to execute the lottery. They'd either draw the birth date from the capsule or from the vessel, and then from another vessel they'd draw the lottery number itself. So it'd be date and lottery number both randomized in this way so as to reduce the possibility of this type of bias.
Okay, that was very particularly interesting about that, because I had known that in the past. And so then, Dalton, you went ahead and you started talking a little bit more about this natural experiment. Yeah, and exactly what is the understanding of that?
Sure. My name is Dalton Conley, and I'm Henry Putnam University professor at Princeton, and have been working in this space for a while. So social behavioral scientists, we would all aspire to the gold standard of the randomized controlled trial that's used in medicine, for example, where the treatment group is given the white pill, and the placebo group is given also a white pill, and neither the doctor nor the subject knows which pill they got until later, when it's all revealed, and they can study whether there's a true treatment effect over and above any placebo effect. But if you think about the social and behavioral outcomes that many of us are interested in, whether people get divorced, how much money they earn, their health outcomes over the long term, mortality and chronic conditions, it's not things we can't certainly assign in secret. I can't be an experimenter and not know whether I've assigned this couple to the divorce condition or to the control condition. And they certainly know what their assignment is. And of course, we can't assign people to divorce, or unless I'm living in a dictatorship of a crazy social scientist, I cannot do that. So for most outcomes, we don't have true randomized controlled trials. So mostly what social and behavioral scientists do is that they try to just basically match on what are called observables, meaning, okay, well, we know lower income people are, because of economic stress, probably are more likely to get divorced. We know that people who got married younger are more likely to get divorced. We know that people who are more religious are less likely to get divorced, and so forth. So we'll try to match everybody on those characteristics, and then see if we were interested in the effect of divorce, say on children, or on happiness or whatever, over and above all those other factors that might affect both divorce and children's well-being, do we see an effect? But that's less than ideal, because there could always be some other factor that's driving. Could be just people who are grumpier are more likely to get divorced, and also aren't so great for their children either. But how do you measure grumpiness? Even if you could measure grumpiness, it's going to have a lot of measurement error. So there's no ideal solution. But around 30 years ago, plus or minus, something that was launched in the social and behavioral sciences was called the causal revolution, where they picked up on natural experiments that would randomize people into treatment and control groups, not by a researcher, but say by an earthquake in Chile, or by a hurricane in Brazil that affects the price of coffee in Colombia, or in example from my own research, what the sex of your firstborn child is in the U.S., which is random. So it's kind of like being a detective and looking for these experiments that just happen to have occurred. And I would argue that the Vietnam draft lotteries was the biggest natural experiment in the history of social sciences. We've had other experiments that were purposeful, that were large scale, run. For example, at the same time, there was a negative income tax experiment that gave a sort of universal basic income to the treatment group and saw what happened. In the 90s, there was a moving to opportunity experiment that moved poor public housing residents into different neighborhoods to see what the effect of neighborhood poverty was. But they were big, but not as big as affecting entire birth cohorts of men in the United States. And so really, the Vietnam draft lottery, I would say, is the largest kind of accidental experiment in social and behavioral sciences. And it's been 50 years. Lots of us have followed up on what's happened between the treatment group exposed to a low draft number and the risk of being drafted, which could mean that they ended up getting drafted and serving in Vietnam, or could it mean that they enlisted in the military to try to get a better assignment, a desk job in a German base, for example, or they fled to Canada, became a conscientious objector. All of that is part of the treatment. Yeah. Mostly it's people becoming veterans either by conscription or by enlistment. And we follow those up and on areas from what happens to their health and well-being and in life expectancy, to their earnings, to whether or not they're a higher likelihood of getting divorced, commit crimes, even what happened, and Tim is involved in a study, to their children in terms of their occupational choices. So it's become a go-to kind of way of studying the effects of military service of that era, and to a certain extent is generalizable to today's military veterans in a professional army where there's no draft. In certain ways, it's not generalizable, and we could talk about that later.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dalton. So I'm going to turn to Lauren. You talked a little bit about the gene-environment interaction and starting to talk about, how we use these quasi-natural experiment that was the draft lottery and how that relates to things that we can learn about health and smoking and different types of effects that are all related. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Lauren Schmitz. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Public Policy Department in the La Follette School of Public Affairs. And a lot of my work as a health economist incorporates genetic data into social science research. And specifically, I study gene-environment interactions to a large degree. What is a gene-environment interaction? It's basically where we see different norms of reaction to the environment because of genotype. So we all have slightly different genetics. If you put us in the same environment, we might have slightly different outcomes based on our underlying genetics. It's very difficult, it turns out, to study this in human populations because, as Dalton mentioned, we can't randomize people, especially into certain social situations, and then see how they're reacting based on genotype. We can't do that. Unlike with model organisms like Drosophila or mice, where we can breed different genotypes and then put them in different cages and expose them to different environments. So how do we, now that we have all this population representative data, that now is also these people have been genotyped, so we have a lot of genetic data on unrelated individuals in these large studies that we can now use to study the question of gene-environment interactions. But in principle, it's actually very difficult to do because you need some sort of randomized environment in order to really tease apart the contribution of genetics and environment on some outcome. And so I use the health and retirement study in my work. And this is a nationally representative longitudinal study of individuals over the age of 50 in the United States that began in 1992. And in 2006, it became cheap enough to start to genotype these people. So they went out in the field and not only asked them questions about, their marital status and how much they make on their job and whether they're retired and so forth, but they also asked them to spit in a cup, and then they were able to genotype them. And so now we can access that data in addition to the social data. We also can see their birth date, so we can know whether they were drafted or not. So this then, around the early, I guess this study came out 4 years ago, we were able to test the Vietnam draft lottery experiment in these individuals and see if there were different norms of reaction by their underlying genetics to certain health outcomes. And the study I presented looked at smoking. And we did find that individuals with really high-risk genotypes for smoking who were drafted were more likely to smoke over their life course than non-veterans, individuals who weren't drafted with similar genotypes. So this predisposition was realized in individuals who were drafted, but not in those who weren't. And so it was a very unique experiment that we could use, and we could see this because it is in principle so difficult to test those things.
Yeah, thank you. So that was an interesting piece. And then you also spoke a little bit about the public sector employment and what we can learn from the draft lottery and how it relates to that and the data that you had collected.
Thanks, Lauren. You bet. So the questions that we can ask as social scientists using the draft lotteries are extensive, and one of the ones that Dalton and I recently explored in an article that's now published at Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences was a question about whether or not wartime mobilization affects the composition of the civilian public sector workforce. So over time, there's been social scientists who have hypothesized that wartime mobilization essentially creates a pool of workers who have taken time from their lives during the peak years of their labor market productivity, and thus, after their service, are in need of some new form of employment. Public jobs offer one form of opportunity that they could pursue. So we explored this hypothesis and others related to it that service in the military will translate into higher levels of public employment in the civilian sector later in life. And the way we did is we contacted the Office of Personnel Management through a Freedom of Information Act request. We asked for the corpus of electronic records of public employees, inclusive of their birth dates, so that we could infer the lottery numbers of the individuals who work in the federal government. Now, of course, in order to maintain the privacy of individuals who work in the public sector and in the federal government, we didn't look at individual level data. Instead, we looked at counts of number of employees who have a given birth date, conditional on whether they identify as a man or a woman, thus allowing us to be able to discern those individuals who had birth dates that made them eligible for the draft lottery, and by virtue of their birth date, and as well by virtue of the fact that they identified as a man, and thus were apt to have their lottery number called. So we got the data from Office of Personnel Management in a condition that allowed us to then start to infer the rates of federal government employment amongst folks with different birth dates. And what you would normally expect is that individuals' birth date is probably unrelated to whether or not they work in the federal government. And so if we look at a count of the number of employees with a given birth date in federal personnel records, we'd expect to see sort of a uniform distribution, not much variation across different birth dates as to the number of employees holding those birth dates themselves. What we ended up finding, though, was that that's not the case when you start to explore the subgroup of individuals who were both eligible for the lottery and who had their lottery numbers called. And so individuals identifying as men who were born who turned 19, in the draft lotteries that took place between 1969 and 1975. They had the possibility of being called, but only in the first 3 years of the draft. After the first 3 years of the draft, they stopped the actual call for induction of lottery numbers. Lottery numbers were still issued to 19-year-old men, but they weren't actually called. And so this creates a placebo group in these later years. The birth cohorts from 1953 to 1956 become a placebo cohort, and then the 19-year-olds who were born from 1950 to 1952, they become the so-called test group. And so when we look at that test group, the question is, do we see that the lottery numbers that were called for induction appear with disproportionate frequency in federal personal records? And indeed, that's what we find. We find that those birth dates are overrepresented, and there's even a declining relationship as you look at the birth dates that were assigned lower lottery numbers, those that were called first for induction, to those higher numbers. So amongst the test group, you find the first, say, 195 or so lottery numbers. There's this decreasing relationship in the number of employees, and then it starts to flatten out. And that flattening out is because at some point the Selective Service System stopped calling lottery numbers. They called this the administrative processing number. This was the highest lottery number that would be called in a given year of the Selective Service lotteries. And so what we find in our data is that highest administrative processing number, that highest ceiling on the numbers that would be called, that's when you start to see the total number of employees turn into roughly a uniform distribution, some kind of flattening out of the relationship between lottery numbers and the total tally of employees that hold the birth dates associated with those numbers.
Yeah, that was a very interesting piece of data. It was really interesting to actually see that data, and because there's such great placebo groups that you have, even just in terms of men and women. So women who were not able to be within the draft lottery. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time, and I'm just thinking about, like, now that 50th anniversary of the draft lottery. what are next steps with what other data, what other interesting things can you do with the draft lottery data? And I'll just like leave it open to the group here.
Since I have the mic right now, I'll just say briefly, I think one of the next steps is to start to explore the way that the various effects that have been identified in the literature might interact with each other. It's to say, hey, look, we now know that public sector employment was affected by lottery numbers. We know that some health outcomes were affected. And so one open question is, how do these all interrelate?
Yeah, I was going to say, as we get more and more biological data, as a lot of these assays become cheaper and cheaper to run, and we can incorporate them into large population-based studies, we can kind of sharpen the microscope and get even deeper underneath the skin. So not just looking at genotype, but looking at epigenomics, gene transcription studies in terms of gene expression. What were the long-term effects on aging in these men, and can we see that at a biological level with things like accelerated epigenetic aging and so forth? So I'm excited to look at that.
I guess to those I would add that a lot of the early studies found, for example, negative effect on wages, negative effect on likelihood of dying, deaths of despair right after the war. But the kind of next wave of studies that I was involved in did not find those effects in the early to mid 2000s, but now almost 20 years after that, and in terms of looking at, for example, long-term mortality or life expectancy effects, they probably might show up again now that the age we're starting to hit the age of increased mortality rates among the veterans. Second is the effect on sort of intergenerational spillover effects on the family members. If this was done in Sweden or Norway, where they have registry data and you basically track you from birth to death and beyond, then we would be able to answer a lot more questions. And the U.S. is actually moving towards building some infrastructure where, for example, census data is linked to tax records, linked intergenerationally, and so forth. To the extent that that occurs in the next decade as a kind of social science infrastructure investment, it'll really multiply the number of questions we're able to explore. And lastly, I would say that folks we learned a lot about the role of military service or of exposure to the draft, actually more precisely, in the late 1960s and early 1970s. We've been involved in the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan, and huge deployments in Iraq, and the issue of deaths of despair is, and post-traumatic stress among veterans has reappeared as a major public health and social issue. However, we do not have a randomized lottery this time around to explore. So I think I anticipate a wave of research that tries to sort of figure out how to properly estimate the effects of military service today, or to make it comparable to what we found 50 years ago. Obviously different context, but it's almost a more important public health issue now than it's ever been.
No, thank you, Dalton. I appreciate that because I was feeling that too. Like, how do we take the lessons learned from what you've learned looking at the Vietnam draft and then apply it to the real time and very timely issues that we're facing today, and how that might look for us as we look into the future. And with that, I think I will say thank you to our speakers. Thank you so much for joining us today, and good luck. And we look forward to hearing what you have for us in the future. Thanks.